Namaskar, good evening. The original space race between the United States and the USSR close to 70 years ago had to do with which country would put the man on the moon the first time. As I said, close to 70 years since that development, the United States now finds itself in another space race. And this time, the competitor is the People's Republic of China. Given that China has done a lot of extensive work, a lot of laudatory work, in fact, in terms of space engagement, it would be an apt time to consider whether indeed we are seeing the emergence of a new space race between the United States and China. Hello and welcome to Study IQ IAS. I am Bhuvan Apurvajha. As today, on the agenda is, United States versus China. Do we have a space race that's brewing? Do we have a situation where we will have a bipolar sort of power centers when it comes to space race, when it comes to space engagement, space exploration? But before that, we have to understand why suddenly are we talking about a space race? Especially considering that, the United States almost effectively shut down its exploration to the moon at least some time ago. So what caused this change all of a sudden? What caused the change is the rise of the Red Dragon. The Chinese emergence on the world stage, on the global stage, has set the stage for a showdown. And if not on the earth, at least in the space. Which is why the hand of United States has been forced. It has been forced to come up with a strategy to counter the Chinese exploration of space. And the target number one for both the countries, it is the moon. Moon is the target once again. Even though moon has been conquered, Neil Armstrong being the first one from humankind to land his feet there. But suddenly we are seeing a reinvigorated thrust, a renewed thrust on moon this time. But this time there's something different. This time the focus is not just on landing on moon and getting back home safely. No. This time the focus is on colonizing moon, on making sure that humanity can use the resources of moon and possibly moon itself for its own explorations, for its own use. And where in moon, might you ask? After all, we have often been told the moon's environment is inhospitable for humankind to survive. That's true. But then these repeated explorations, these repeated projects by countries from across the world, they have chanced upon some important facts. So, what do we know right now? Moon is supposed to contain valuable resources such as water ice, minerals, and rare elements. Now, these resources could be potentially harnessed for space manufacturing, fuel production, and construction. Now, one might also conjure up that, can we get these resources back to Earth? That wouldn't be cost effective right now. However, a technology is under development and what could see a possibility in the near future wherein that could be possible, that you could harness the resources off the surface of the moon and probably bring them back to Earth. But for the time being, the focus of humanity is on making sure that you use the resources of moon and use it as a launch pad for further deep space exploration. We also know that moon has water ice, especially near its poles. So how does that help us now? Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen, which essentially becomes the fuel for the propellants of the rocket, which makes deep space exploration, moon, an ideal choice for a stopover, for a base, for a launch pad to make sure that humanity can indeed, go and colonize Mars in the near future. That would require a stopover in the middle. Moon could be the possible one. So now that you know this, that the lunar South Pole, that's an area of interest for all the countries, for at least all the spacefaring nations. And what evidence has caused that to function? Hi, Jyotirmay, how are you? So what evidence has caused that to function now? The lunar South Pole is believed to store vast amounts of water ice and has low levels of light, which means that it's suitable for a base. After all, It's not in direct line of sight with the sun. You have temperatures roughly around 0 degrees centigrade. The temperature is manageable. The gravity can be taken care of, which means that, well, that could be a possible place. Now, all the countries, all the spacefaring nations have their eye on the South Pole, especially the lunar South Pole. Now, one might again argue, so what happens if, say, China reaches first and sets up a base there? Aren't there any treaties or laws to stop China from doing that? Well, you have the Outer Space Treaty now. The first one is the Outer Space Treaty. Now, India is also a signatory to this treaty. It's in fact considered to be the most fundamental framework based on which all the other space-related treaties have come so far. And that essentially says that, well, you can use the space for exploration. It belongs to all of humanity. And that you can use for peaceful purposes. At least in terms of moon, it says, well, you can use moon for peaceful purposes. So the question now for you, my audience, does commercialization and commercial exploitation of the resources on the moon, does it fall under the purview of peaceful purposes? Again, that's open to interpretation. The law is silent there. At least the treaty is silent there. Thereafter, you have another treaty called the Moon Treaty, which essentially forbids any such exploitation of the moon. However, none of the spacefaring nations, United States, Russia, China, India, well, none of the major spacefaring nations have signed it. Curiously, one country that indeed has signed the Moon Treaty is Pakistan. Well, one can only say the closest one of them can find themselves to the moon is when they hold their national flag. Otherwise, it doesn't make to sign that particular document. However, that's the status. You have two treaties, Outer Space Treaty as well as the Moon Treaty. This has been signed by almost all the major spacefaring nations, whereas this has not been signed by any spacefaring nation. So, well, all the bets are off in terms of whichever country reaches first, colonizes the moon, uses it as a commercial launch pad, well, there's nothing to stop it. Now going forward, and we will understand the Chinese perspective of their space exploration. Now, with like most things Chinese, well, things are not straightforward. So this is a quote by the head of their space agency, the former head of the space agency, who says, the universe is an ocean, the moon is Dao Islands, Mars is Huangan Island. If we don't go there now, even though we are capable of doing so, we will be blamed by our descendants. Well, simple statement. Talks about probably national pride, at least. On prima facie, that's what it looks like. But then this is where the Chinese are good at. If you were to understand this, well, these two terms, the Dao Island and the Huangan Island, are to do with areas in the South China Sea. This is in fact the shoal that we have learned, the Scarabolo Shoal, that is in the South China Sea. Whereas again, this is to do with a certain island, the Senkaku Island. So essentially, China making its ambitions, its aim very clear. They are not there for peaceful purposes. They are there to colonize moon. They are there to make it Chinese territory. So, Beijing uses its space ambitions as a powerful ideological and expansionist tool of statecraft. Others use it for science exploration, for technological development. Well, China uses them for that too. But alongside that, and it vocalizes about it too, that, well, I am going to use my space ambitions to further my ideological and expansionist interests. So, well, how did this whole come about? Like, how did it happen? One might ask. So, well, China's first satellite launch was only in 1970. However, the turning point comes just after the year 2000. In 2003, the Chinese launched their first taikonaut. Like the Russians have cosmonaut, the Americans have astronaut, the Chinese now have named their spacefarers as taikonaut. So this is the turning point. And after that, you see a lot of investment insofar as Chinese Space Agency is concerned. In fact, when you were to consider this particular statement here, this does not come just out of the blue. This has a lot of backing to it. This is a national mission that they have embarked upon, and given that the present President Xi Jinping is in fact someone who gives a lot of thrust, not just in outer space exploration, but also a deep crust exploration. So this has become a center point of Chinese science and technology. So when you go forward, you have a look at this particular question now. So is there a space race between China and the United States? Well, again, like most difficult questions, the answer to this is not so straightforward. Some might say yes and some might say no, and well, both would be correct at their particular positions. Why? Well, because this current situation can be described best as complex hegemony. What is complex hegemony? Well, in fact, you do have on the blue end the United States and on the red end China. However, given that United States has been out of the game for a long time, it has now decided to change its strategy. It now it kind of banks upon its allies. It also banks upon its private industry. You have seen the emergence of SpaceX. Jeff Bezos has now come up with his own spacefaring company. So America is now sort of catalyzing its private industry alongside NASA, whereas China is exclusively focusing on its space agency. At the same time, United States enjoys support of major spacefaring nations, European Union, Canada, Japan, India. So again, the battle lines are also drawn insofar as space exploration is concerned. So when we go forward now, we will try and look at the differences. What is the actual difference when it comes to the money, the effort, the capital, the ability? Well, United States in 2021 had a budget of $60 billion. Now the Chinese claim that, well, their budget was $16 billion. Now, why is this claim not believable? Well, firstly, if you look at it, so USA has 7 spaceports which are spread across the world. 13 are in development. China has 4 existing spaceports with 2 in development. China has also built its own International Space Station equivalent. So the Americans claim that, well, if China is doing it at 1/3 their budget, well, essentially NASA should shut down. But then that claim can be countered with developing nations such as India now cost-cutting and rationalizing their expenses when it comes to space explorations. So there is a counterpoint to that too. However, independent experts claim that China's investment in the last 5 years is close to $250 billion. Essentially, their defense budget is routed, and the space budget is considered to be a part of the defense budget. The demarcation is not very clear in the Chinese system. So now when we go forward, you'll understand and look at these stats. The Americans operate 64% of all satellites. The Chinese only close to 550. At the same time, like I told you, America boasts of a strong network of allies. It has alliances with good, brilliant spacefaring nations, space agencies, private industries, while China is standing alone. China has a crisis of credibility, and despite repeated calls by the Chinese side to its, say, neighboring countries to come and engage with it in the spacefaring explorations, well, not many have shown a positive inclination. So when we go forward now, we try and understand that there needs to be nuance to this comparison too. After all, it can't be so completely tilted in United States' favor. And that's true. In 2021, China attempted more orbital launches than United States. And curiously so, most of the orbital launches had military or governmental launch pads, payloads. They were all to do with surveillance and optical imaging. China expanding its surveillance footprint across the globe. Whereas on the other hand, with United States having effectively bowed out of this game some time ago and now making a comeback, well, most of their thrust was on military, non-military, academic and commercial payloads. There is straight away the dichotomy that you see here, the divergence of thought. And then we look at these two particular entities, which are essentially going to chart the course of this whole space race. The International Space Station, the crown in the space jewel of United States, and not just United States, in fact, all the countries that have come together, in spite of their differences that might exist on planet Earth, will they do all cooperate to make sure that the ISS functions smoothly round the clock since the last 24 years. At the same time, China's entry into the market with its blue-eyed boy, the Tiangong space station. Both now operational, completely operational, and we'll take a comparative look at how they shape up against each other. And like I told you, Americans enjoy a lot of credibility when it comes to their spacefaring capabilities. The Chinese, not much. Not much. The Chinese are left alone. In fact, it's the CNSA that's taking on the collective might of NASA, of SpaceX, of Blue Origin. SpaceX by Elon Musk, Blue Origin by the Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. NASA obviously belongs to the government of United States. All of them together with their collective might now taking on the PRC's CNSA. So now when we go forward, we try and look and understand at the difference. Where is the difference? When you compare side by side the ISS vis-a-vis the Tiangong. So the ISS launched in 1998. In fact, like I told you, a shining example of inter-nation collaboration and cooperation. You had the Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency all coming together, pooling their resources, pooling their talent to make sure that the ISS becomes a reality. At the same time, you have seen plus 16 countries, close to 16 countries that have collaborated at some time or the other, in some form or the other, with the International Space Station. In fact, this is the largest artificial object in the solar system and the largest satellite in low Earth orbit. The ISS has these two claims to fame for itself. Like I told you, a shining example of international cooperation, and this is important for us to consider now, that the ISS is due to be decommissioned just 8 years from now, which means that the Tiangong, the Chinese space station, will be the last one standing. What would that mean for China going forward, given that they have made their ambitions absolutely clear insofar as using Moon as a launch pad, commercializing Moon, making sure that the synchronization of Moon happens? The Chinese are going to be the last people standing, at least insofar as the ISS is concerned, the space stations are concerned. Now when you look at the Chinese side, so the Tiangong space station launched in 2021 and China is the sole owner. Well, it claims to have called for a lot of cooperation and collaboration with fellow spacefaring agencies, but well, there is nothing happening on that sort. So it is left alone. Tiangong is smaller than ISS. In fact, it has a capacity of 3, whereas ISS can include up to 11 and has had a maximum of 13 astronauts, cosmonauts, the way you look at it, at a time. This is going to be operational till 2035. The Chinese claim that it will only be there till 2032, but then Chinese claims are Chinese claims. Independent researchers say that well, at least 2035 is what they are aiming at. China has the advantage of learning where others have failed. They have learned from previous explorations, previous failures of US Space Agency, of the Russians, and then they have maneuvered and made sure that the products they launch are workable. And so far, they have done well for themselves. So going forward now, it's important to again take a look at this whole debate in an objective and fair manner. So firstly, we have to understand about the Artemis Accords. Now, since US was out of the game for a long time, so the US then decided that, well, we are going to go back to the moon, primarily driven by China's emergence. And then came the Artemis Accords. Return to the moon by 2025 was what was claimed, and then to Mars and beyond. Whereas the Chinese, well, they have made their claims absolutely clear. They say that we are going there on or before 2030. The space race, the US claiming a couple of years' time, Chinese 5 years later, but then the race is well and truly on. At the same time, this international agreement, the Artemis Accords, it outlines shared principles of cooperation, and through this program, the whole objective is return people to the moon by 2025 and establish a moon base. Where the moon base would be located? Well, lunar South Pole. Why? Like I told you, two particular reasons. One, I'll just use red ink here. So, what are the reasons? One, you have emergence of and presence of water ice. And second, temperatures of 0 degrees. Third, it has shade. It's not in the direct line of sight of the sun, which makes lunar South Pole prime real estate. Whereas, when you look at the Chinese side now, so US and China both have landed rovers on Mars, and now Beijing has said that, well, we are going to land a spacecraft on an asteroid. China's intentions very clear, that they are going to match toe to toe with the efforts of the United States. So this future international lunar research station, like I said, again, is claimed to be open to all parties, but then where are the parties that are invited? There are none so far. So now, but again, just to quickly understand this here, Artemis Accords in the Indian context. Well, India is not a part of the Artemis Accords yet. Okay? Independent reports, media reports suggest that, well, an implementation agreement has been signed by the government of India. It is claimed to be a legal document. However, ISRO has not signed any particular instrument of agreement or a memorandum of understanding. So that is it. India is not currently a part of the Artemis Accords. Going forward now, and before I conclude this very short presentation, so from the mains perspective, if you have to understand this, especially for the UPSC examination, well, what's the line you would take? How would you present this in an answer? So if this question were to be given to you, that what are China and the United States in a space race? Well, they are in a space race insofar as getting to the moon is concerned. However, that's only half the story. Now the objective is that, well, it's no more about who could reach the star first and return home. It is about surviving and thriving in space. That will require cooperation. That will require collaboration. You cannot have a situation where earthly geopolitics is being played out on the surface of moon. That would be catastrophic, not just for the people there, the individuals who are fighting it out on behalf of the people here, but also for us as a whole. That would possibly be the tipping point for international geopolitics. At the same time, despite its decisive lead, the US has chosen to partner with others. Why? Well, it realizes it's unable to do it alone. It cannot do it alone. The amount of collaboration and effort that requires moon to be made into a base from Earth to Mars, well, it's beyond the realm of possibility for one country to do it. CSA belongs to Canada. Okay? So it's beyond the possibility of one country to do it. So which is why it's the right strategy that you go ahead, cooperate, collaborate. which is why in the Artemis Accords, you have nations, 24 nations have already signed up for it, and more will in the coming days. Well, China, it wants to do the same, but it is doing so at a smaller scale. Its partnerships are with nations that are not truly spacefaring nations. Okay? So, the picture that emerges is that not of a race, but of a complex system with the US as a leader. Okay? Like I told you, it's complex hegemony when it comes to the space race. It's not outright so simple that you can give a yes or no answer. Because again, when you consider the facts that, well, United States will lose its ISS by 2030, the Chinese are going to be there for 2035, tech would have improved definitely with the advent of AI and all of these things happening. Tech will improve in the next 12 years. Would a possibility so arise that the Chinese would be the first ones to make that lunar base? What happens to the Outer Space Treaty? What happens to the reaction of the countries here? All of this will play out given, and these are in fact the natural consequences of the space race that we are discussing today. Okay? All right. On that note, it's a wrap from me, Bhuvan Apurvajha at Study IQ IAS. I make a lot of such videos on topics that interest me, on topics that are of relevance for civil services students, especially for the mains perspective. And in fact, I have been lucky this time as one of my videos on the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis. Well, this was asked in this year's prelims in UPSC. Again, not to tom-tom my own trumpet, but then these are the videos, the kind of information that you should be consuming. Because, well, if you have seen the paper this time, there is no method to this madness. You would be best advised to consume information from all sources. Keep your mind open when it comes to consuming information. On that note, it's a wrap from me, Bhuvan Apurvajha, for Study IQ IAS. Till I see you tomorrow evening, 9 p.m. with some other content, something interesting that'll catch your eye. It's a wrap. Thanks for watching. Good night.